I am here in the home of the Starks, the North, and it felt appropriate to be out here as we talk about Westeros. It's quiet, it is beautiful, there are no people for miles around, and it definitely brings up the feeling Martin was clearly trying to emulate when creating the North. House of the Dragon Episode 3 opens with this feud, this battle between the Brackens and the Blackwoods. Two houses in the Riverlands who have had a feud for generations going back. And you can look at it as a microcosm of the Dance of the Dragons conflict as a whole and of George R. R. Martin's underlying philosophy around writing war. These two families have this bitter feud going back generations over what? Well, in the episode, we're told that the cause is lost to time. It's borders, it's blood, it's revenge, it's religion. The Blackwoods being one of the few families south of the Neck who still hold to the old gods, while the Brackens adopted the faith of the Seven. At the beginning of this episode, Rhaenys said something really interesting. She's talking about how it's spiraling out of control, and she says, "Hotter blood has prevailed, I think. Young men have taken the bit in their teeth to punish, to avenge. Soon they will not remember whatever began the war in the first place." Rhaenyra is quick to point out that the war started when the Greens tried to usurp her throne. But Rhaenys asks, is that true? Is that really the cause of the war? Or was it when the child was beheaded? Or when Aemon killed Luke? Or when Luke took Aemon's eye? We teeter now at the point when none of it will matter. The desire to burn and kill takes over. Reason is forgotten. That at the end of all of this, people will have forgotten the point of the conflict, the reason it started in the first place. And let's place that in the context of that Bracken and Blackwood feud. In the opening scene, two Bracken and Blackwood boys have this border spat. One accuses the other of moving some border stones. They each declare for Rhaenyra or Aegon, but what's really interesting is what's happening between the lines. The Bracken boy pulls out his sword and boasts to his friends about how it's sharp enough and he's good enough to kill Blackwoods. And when he's challenged, he has this clear moment of hesitancy. Is he ready to fight? But when he turns around, he wants to be seen as brave. He wants glory. He wants to live up to that Bracken narrative. And when the Blackwood boy in turn declares, "Aegon is no true king," he adds on, "and you are no true knight." It's those words that ultimately matter more in a way. The insult, the bravado, the hotter blood, as Rhaenys puts it, is more important than any real allegiance to Queen Rhaenyra or King Aegon. And so we ask ourselves, did the Battle of the Burning Mill start when the Bracken boy declared for King Aegon? Or was it when they moved the boundary stones? Or was it when one of them betrayed the other 10 years ago? Or when the Brackens supposedly poisoned the Blackwood weirwood tree all of those years ago? Fire and Blood is a history book. It's full of biases and contradictions. And when it talks about this battle, it talks about it in the context of King Aegon losing his last allies in the Riverlands. It talks about it being over the allegiance to Rhaenyra or Aegon, but when we see it play out, we can see it is about a lot more than that, and that it goes back a lot further. It misses the intimate context that so much of history takes place in. All of these people pushing, and when Rhaenys offers that the conflict truly began when Aemon lost his eye, it's speaking to Aemon's desire to prove himself, to live out his role as the most dangerous weapon in Westeros, to prove himself potentially as a better king than his own brother. It's like how when Rhaenyra presses Daemon over the murder of this child, she brings out how it's really about Daemon trying to spite her over the fact that Viserys passed over him for the throne. It's him living out that resentment and belief in his own superiority than any real allegiance to Rhaenyra, to their cause. Equally, it could be said the conflict truly began when Otto conspired to press his daughter to be married to Viserys, splitting the royal house in two, all to further the hopes of House Hightower, an aim that still fundamentally underpins the conflict today. Like with the Blackens and the Blackwoods, who should be on the throne at the end of all of this matters a lot less to these people than the opportunities that war itself presents, what they can get out of it. For Otto Hightower and Corlys Velaryon, it is tying their family to the Iron Throne. For the Blackwoods and the Brackens, it's an opportunity to settle this generation's old score. For the Triarchy, it's trade routes. For the Greyjoys, who knows what it'll be. And on a more personal level, for Daemon, it's Targaryen blood and fire and glory. For Aemon, it's finally putting his skills into use to be the person he wants to be. And for Larys, it's feet. Because ultimately, when history tries to explain the true causes of something, it necessarily obfuscates some degree of reality. But more than all of this, George R. R. Martin has always rejected war as this glorious thing. You see, that's what the Bracken and Blackwood kids are kind of doing. They're kind of thinking war's this fun, glorious thing, a way to prove themselves, and then an instant later, they're dead. They're in a field of dark, bloody mess. His heroes are broken by war. There is little glory to be found in it, and what glory is there for the dead? His stories are full of heroic acts, and yet society will often shun them. They will not praise or honor them. Jaime Lannister's most heroic and honorable act, one that's truly glorious in stopping the Mad King, is ultimately his foremost point of shame, something that causes others to shun him. Westeros is a society which really only pretends to care about honor and chivalry. There's a line in the books which I could not find as much as I searched, so if you do know the one I'm talking about, please leave it down in the comments below, where basically it says that after King Jaehaerys' reign, which was a peaceful time, like 70 years or something, there was this whole generation of young boys who had been raised up to fight, who are really good with the sword, who had been told of the stories of battles of old, but they had never fought. What was to be expected of whole generations of young men trained up to do violence, to imagine that as an important part of themselves, to not teach them about the horrors of war, and then finally there's an opportunity for them to explore that. Because at the end of it all, the why of how it started is mostly a point of historical interest. Violence begets violence, small acts of cruelty begets larger acts of cruelty, and that's what we've seen over and over. And thousands of people are still dead, the poor suffering the rich man's private insecurity. Exactly how far this conflict has yet to spiral remains to be seen, but as Rhaenys says in this episode, there is no war more hateful than one between kin, none more bloody than one between dragons. A core conflict in this episode is King Aegon wants to go out into the battlefield. He wants to prove himself. He says, I'm just as dangerous, just as well trained as all of them. Now, in the books, this is framed as Aegon was furious. He wanted to fire and blood for revenge, to make good on everything that's happened. But it's interesting that in the episode we can see that it's really about his insecurity. It's really about this fear that, oh, I'm not as dangerous. I'm not a real dragon. It's that petty, childish desire to prove he's just as badass as Aemon or Daemon. The same motive we see in the opening scene of the episode. This episode has 3 other interesting things I want to talk about though. Number 1, what the hell happened with Daemon? He arrives at Harrenhal, it falls to him, and then he gets these kind of magical visions. He gets teleported to a weirwood tree. You might be wondering what's going on. Now, I can't say too much because of spoilers, but Harrenhal is this famously cursed castle. It's a ruin after Aegon the Conqueror showed up, and Aegon was like, you can't hurt me, I'm in a big castle, and Aegon was like, you know what that is? That's an oven. We saw Harrenhal in the original series when Tywin met Arya, and it's famously kind of cursed, full of ghosts. And we're seeing a little bit of that spookiness here. But Daemon does meet someone weird here, and that someone is Alys Rivers. Again, I can't give you too much information about her because of spoilers, but she's a character who is very open to interpretation. It was really hard to know from reading the book how she would ever be portrayed in the show. And with that in mind, I am going to give you a quote from the book. Was she a serving wench who dabbled in potions and spells, says Munkin, a wood witch, claims Septon Eustace, a malign enchantress who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, Mushroom would have us believe. Was she in truth a witch who lay with demons, bringing forth dead children as payment for the foreknowledge they gave her? Was she a simple-minded slattern, as Eustace believes, a wanton who used potions and poisons to bind men to her body and soul? She is supposedly the nurse mother of a bunch of babes at Harrenhal, and history has conflicting opinions about who or what she was. But it's very clear that the show is leaning into that enchantress angle. She shows Daemon these visions of a young Rhaenyra, who he basically groomed. He shows a dead Jaehaerys, the child he had murdered. These are visions of his guilt, of the things he has done, and she tells him, you will die here. It remains to be seen what will happen. But two theories. Number one, she teleports him to a weirwood tree. Now, Harrenhal is situated on the shore of the God's Eye, which is this lake with an island in the middle of it with a bunch of weirwoods. It's sort of this hot spot for old magical energy. So potentially she's tied to that kind of old magic. But there are also lots of rumors about how old she might be. And theoretically, some people have suggested she might be Melisandre. Especially if they are leaning into the Enchantress, because she could have just been a nobody. She could have just been a nurse mother who people told bad stories about. But they are leaning into that. Either way, I'm really interested to see what they do with her character. The second thing that really stood out in this episode is Rhaenyra's secret mission, which for me felt a little bit too close to like season 8 of Game of Thrones. It was way too convenient, really weirdly contrived, and I did not like it. The thing is that the scene itself, where they're actually talking, is really great. It's them talking through this miscommunication, realizing the layers to it, but the reason that they're talking, the framing for it, it felt too convenient. Characters just sort of teleporting around the place. I was not a fan. This was a recklessly stupid plan. And like, it's not a criticism to say it's recklessly stupid. As we've seen, lots of characters are recklessly stupid. But this felt out of sync with Rhaenyra's character, like, in this little part. Out of sync with kind of just the rest of the series, the quality of the rest of the series, in terms of her, like, going undercover, not talking to anyone, and turning up at the Sept, and talking to Alicent, not getting her captured, and somehow getting out again. It would have been fine if through Larys and Mysaria they just arranged to meet on a neutral island and have a little talk to each other, Alicent and Rhaenyra. It would have accomplished the same thing and it wouldn't have had this little layer. But ultimately, it's not the end of the world, it's just one detail that I didn't really like, and so far the season has been a really high bar regardless. What I do want to say is I think this might be solving a problem that I thought the writers might have with the book. Now, if you don't want any spoilers of any kind, this is only going to be mild spoilers, vague gesturing, but if you don't want anything at all, then skip to this timestamp. Great, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so in the books, at this point, Rhaenyra doesn't have a lot to do. She just kind of sits around a bit, and other characters like Daemon and Corlys, they go out and they do a lot of traveling and fighting and negotiating. And I was looking at that and I was going, they're going to want Rhaenyra doing more stuff. And to me, I was looking at this scene when I was watching this and I was going, this is them trying to get Rhaenyra to do more stuff. And I don't think that they did it as well as they could have. But it's just one thing. The third thing is random Targaryen dude. You saw him halfway through the episode. He's called Ulf, I think it was, and he claims to be the son of Balon the Brave. It was sort of like thrown at you over a few sentences. If you're not a fan of the books, you probably missed it. Balon is the son of King Jaehaerys the Conciliator. That's the guy that we saw at the beginning of the series where there was like the election about who should come after him. Balon was really cool, he rode Vhagar, he might have been gay with his brother, did a bunch of cool stuff before dying of appendicitis, and this guy claims to be his bastard son. He calls himself a Dragonseed, and that's an important term that you'll need to know for the future. Because what might Dragonseed, who have Targaryen blood in them, be able to do? I don't know. We'll find out. But overall, I think this episode was symbolically really strong. I really loved how all of these narratives were feeding into one another. They're really hammering home just this cycle of pointless violence, which, if you've read the book, you will know where this ends up going, and I think that that is a really interesting angle to take with it, with how they're doing it and how they're framing it. Maybe not as good as the last episode, and that bit with Alicent and Rhaenyra, not very strong, but overall, really fun. I'm still really looking forward to the next episode, and I'm loving it, absolutely. I know some people were a little bit peeved about not seeing the battle. You know, this is Game of Thrones. Where are the battles? But need I remind you, Tyrion was heading into battle, he got knocked on the head, and they really only showed us the important battles, and I promise you, there are plenty of important battles to come. This was a minor skirmish, basically. But I would love to know what you thought of the episode down below. Am I right about Alicent and Rhaenyra? Am I overreacting? I might be. I don't know. What did you think about the themes and how that was communicated? Did you pick it up? Let me know down below, stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future. But also, we're talking fantasy, and I am a fantasy writer, and I want you to read my stories. They are linked down below. About a girl who washes up on a beach where all forgotten things appear, or a family who has lived with death in their house for generations. Or there's a story about ancient creatures who hold funerals for humanity's stories, who watch our civilization rise and fall. They're all linked down below.